Okay, let's talk about the game that 5 million people are playing as you're watching this DVD. 5 million, maybe 10 million. It's amazing what's happening in the online poker world. And you know what I love about this? Listen to this. I'm sitting at home, at my computer, in my study, playing online poker, and winning all of this money. I won $155,000 in 1 week last month. I lost back $70,000 the next two plays. Still, I'm sitting at home and my mind, I'm making all this money on my mind, basically. I'm playing cyber poker with others and winning all this money. It's just such a beautiful thing to me. And it's one reason why online poker has just exploded. Now, one of the things you'll find is it's just too damn easy to press a button. Raise it, raise it, raise it, raise it. You don't have to throw in chips. You know, I mean, it's your turn to act. You have advanced play buttons, you know, and it's just too easy to say, let me raise it. And a lot of people, when they first get used to playing online poker, that's what they do. They raise way, way, way too often. What you need to do is you need to somehow play the same way in cyberspace that you do in the real world. Never is it more important for you to pay attention to my top 10 hand strategy than when you're playing online poker, because frankly, there's a ton of jackal, megalomaniac opponents out there, and also some of the eagles that play in the game. And I know that all the top players in the world play online poker for high stakes. Some of those guys are playing a lot smaller stakes than they're used to. They might, sure, 300, 600 seems like a huge game to you. These guys play 4,000, 8,000 every day. So they're playing too fast. And if they're going to make a mistake, they want to make it by playing too aggressively. So with all these megalomaniac, crazy players that are playing the internet, including some of the best players in the world who just aren't used to playing that small a limit, you really need to do is you really need to grind it out. Or slow play a lot. Play very few hands. And when you do play those hands, you can play them aggressively, or if you have a table full of megalomaniacs, you can let them do all the betting for you. You have pocket aces, let them raise, let them bet the flop, let them bet the turn, and then let them bet the river, and then finally pop them on the river. You can do that. Online poker, I don't know what's going on out there, but some of the guys that have won millions of dollars in online poker, and you have to think of it this way, 10 million people play online poker. It's just a natural, normal occurrence that 2% of those people will flip a coin, they'll come up heads, 15 out of 17 tries. And so you have a lot of inexperienced players that get to some very high limits. And all of these inexperienced that get to the high limits that really aren't supposed to be there, that don't have the skill to be there, all of these players have one thing in common. They all play like megalomaniacs. They all raise too much. Because aggressiveness gives you a chance to accumulate a lot. Now, I like to play against this new crop of players that's megalomaniacs, and to just sit there and wait for the top 10 hands. You know what? I don't care how lucky you've been in the past. You still have to beat Phil Hellmuth's pocket queens.
Playing poker is like getting into a cold war and you need ammunition. If you've just started to heat up, here are some things you ought to know about poker games and tournaments. The rule number 1. Playing with too many hands is a big no-no. According to poker professionals, many poker starter players commit the mistake of playing with too many hands because they thought that by doing so will mindlessly mean winning more, when actually it means losing more. What is important to know is that you're supposed to be playing merely excellent starting hands if you're a poker newbie. Try opening up your range while getting more attempts to play poker. Rule number 2. Examine anything that you are saying. Bring to mind with your hands, not your mouth. A general understanding on poker games is that players blunt their way to victory. Not. Poker is a game of wit, plans, and focus. Bluffing is just tenuously part of it. Rule number 3. By no means toss good money following the bad. At times, a single card is sufficient to ruin your plan and can be disappointing having to lose a big amount of cash. Rule 4. Keep your focus in the game. Commit to memory when you are still learning about Texas Hold'em. It can be difficult enough to keep your mind on the cards. You can cover the most important advantage if you have the attentiveness to flop your opponents. Rule 5. It is not ideal for you to play when you're undergoing pressure or when you're expressive. Most players tend to vent their dissatisfaction through games when they play, such as poker. The downside is that you don't get to play as well, and it tends to flare up pretty effortlessly. You also tend to have an inclination to do impulsive gambling. Rule 6. Bestow due consideration on the other players. When playing live poker, observe their hand movements, their bets, and the things they say. These gestures can assist you to win, and if you didn't catch it, you're bound to lose the game. Rule number 7. Know your limits and play within the boundary of your poker bankroll. To avoid leaving the poker game house broke, consider that you have mouths to nourish and a job you must return to the following day. Rule number 8. Play games that you fully understand. In other words, don't hesitate to ask, especially if you do not understand the game, because not asking is pride and can cost you a lot. Further, this tip applies to modern games these days. Poker has been innovated with many strategies, rules, and others. There's now Raz, 5-card draw, Omaha, and the 8 game, and Horse. If you're too shy to ask, at least do your homework prior to playing the game. Rule number 9, and probably the most important, enjoy the game. At times, poker players tend to be really stressed and rattled while playing. Little do they know they're missing out on the most fundamental part of the game, fun. Poker is a very exciting game, and when played well, you have money as a reward. With that said, poker tends to be a very addicting game, and can in turn into a very worse condition of gambling. Some people have even suffered great loss of their family and wealth because of this addiction. Remember not to let chance dictate your life. Online poker is indeed fun, but to make sure that you know how to balance your priorities and family and wealth, you are in control of the game, not the other way around. Thank you so much from Betting Tips 101, and stay tuned for more.
Now let's talk about factoring in bluff outs when you have drawing hands on the turn. There are certain situations where it's highly likely that your opponent will fold to a bet on the river when you hit some of your drawing hands. Knowing this, we can take advantage of those opponents by sometimes calling with long shot draws with the intention of either A, hitting a home run, or B, bluffing your opponent when a more traditional draw hits the river. I call those bluffing outs, cards that could hit the river that will scare your opponent into folding the best hand. Using bluff outs in your calculations on the turn is pretty advanced. Not only are you now factoring in your pot odds, odds of improving, odds of drawing to a second best hand, and implied odds, you should also think about what cards could hit the river that will likely win you the pot by allowing you to bluff your opponent. Being able to read your opponent and understand their tendencies and their likely hold cards is a big part of using bluff outs. Let's look at an example. With blinds at 100-200, a tight opponent raises from first position to 600. Both you and your opponent have 45,000 apiece, and you call the 600 with 3-5 of clubs for middle position. All others fold. The flop comes 5, 6, 7, giving you bottom pair and a gut shot straight shot to the idiot end. You could easily have the best hand here with a pair of 5s, but if your opponent bets it hard on the flop and the turn, he probably has a big overpair. Okay, so on the flop, your opponent bets 1,000. Now trying to catch a 3, 4, or 5, you call the bet. The turn card is the jack of clubs, giving you a backdoor flush draw as well. With 3,500 in the pot, your opponent overbets the pot, betting 7,000. Now it's time to go through your routine as you see here. So, we have pot odds, 7,000 to win 10,500 is 1.5 to 1. Odds of improving your hand, there's 3 3s, 2 5s, 3 4s, and 9 spades equals 17 outs out of 46 unseen cards. That's 17 good ones and 29 bad ones. So that works out to about 1.7 to 1. Despite the fact that you likely have a ton of outs against your opponent, you're still not getting the right price to call the bet, unless you factor in implied odds as well as bluff outs. There are loads of cards that could hit the river that miss your hand completely, but would look like they could easily hit your hand. An 8 would put an open-ended 4-card straight on the board. A 9 would mean that if you had the 4-card straight draw with an 8, that it just completed that draw. On top of that, the flush draw on the flop is a hand you could easily represent if it hits the river. I'm going to remind you one more time to stress the importance of this. In order to make plays like the following, it's essential that you have a very good read on your opponent's tendencies. If you don't, I would advise avoiding these plays altogether. With the type of draw you have, there are some cards that could hit on the river that would win you a really big pot. There are also a lot of cards that could hit that will scare your opponent into thinking that you just hit one of your draws. If you only play suited connectors with the hopes of making straights and flushes, you'll become very easy to read. Sure, people will know that you play all kinds of goofy hands, but they will soon catch on to the fact that when the funky draw hits and you bet big, that you've got it. Perceptive players will stop paying you off unless you mix up your play by making some calculated bluffs as well. Let's take a look at how to proceed with various cards hitting the river after calling the 7,000 bet. A club. Obviously, if a club hits completing your flush, you're going to look to make a value bet in the hopes that it gets paid off. With 17,500 in the pot, a bet of anywhere from 9,000 to 12,000 will put some pressure on your opponent, but not so much so that he might not actually look you up. After all, there was only one club on the flop, so it'll be difficult for your opponent to believe you hit a backdoor flush. A straight. If you hit the straight, it will be the dummy end with the 4. But since your opponent is a conservative player, it's unlikely that he has an 8 in his hand. As far as betting amounts go, you have a lot of options. But understand that your opponent will be hard-pressed to call anything. You could even try to milk him for as little as 5,000, but it's probably better to bet between 7,000 and 9,000. Reason being, you don't want your value bets to stick out by making them so much smaller than your bluffs. You don't want to make your bluffs any smaller either, since that will make them less effective. Trips. A 5 is probably the absolute best card you can catch, as your opponent might think it was a good card for his pocket aces. If you hit trips on the river and you put your opponent on overpair, you should go for a good payday, betting between 12,000 to 15,000 on the river. 2 pair. Your opponent isn't going to be too scared of a 3, but at the same time, he isn't going to bet that card either. If you bet the river, he's probably going to pay you off with an overpair. So once again, I would suggest a bet between 9,000 and 12,000. An 8. Now if the river's an 8, this gives you a good opportunity to steal the pot from your opponent. You don't want this bet to look any different from a bet you'd make had you actually made the hand for real. If you bet 12,000 on the river, your opponent would be hard-pressed to call. He might, but even if he called you, half the time, your river bluff would still be profitable, as you're risking 12,000 to win 17,500. If a 9 hits the river, play it the exact same way you would as an 8. If a spade hits the river, This is the most common draw that you could be on after calling the flop bet, and is probably the card your opponent is most afraid of. You want to play it as if you were looking to get paid off handsomely, and should try betting between 12 to 15,000. As is the case with all the other various scenarios, the amount you should ultimately choose should depend on your opponent and his perception of you. Also, past hands that he's witnessed you play. So as you can see, despite the fact that you really only have what looks like 17 outs, when you factor in the bluff outs, there are 28 cards that could help you win the pot. That's well over half the deck. Of course, it's not that simple, obviously, as you'll get yourself into trouble occasionally when you hit your hand and it's a loser. Or when your bluffs get called by an opponent who just doesn't believe you. Overall, though, adding these plays to your repertoire will help you out in the long run, since your value bet to bluff ratio will be very high. Bluffs are most effective when used sporadically, and in situations where it seems obvious to your opponent that you must have the best hand.
hands.
Yeah.
I guess I'm going to have to call you.
Some of us get a little more often. We've lived a charmed life. I can't help it. They come every 100 hands.
Think of Filicek. He had pocket aces, and in between the pocket aces, he did it twice. I bet 20 hands went by in between the two.
Absolutely.
He was just hanging.
Yep. Those 2 aces are what's got him here to playing heads up right now. Those two times waking up with aces. You're right about that. I don't think even aces 3 times back-to-back could save him now. Phil's going to dodge bullets. He says it himself. He'll dodge bullets if he has to.
And now Filicek goes all in.
Well, Filicek at least now is finally moving all in.
Ace-10 of clubs, and I don't see Phil calling here.
Unless he wakes up with a hand, you never know.
You do never know. You're right.
Phil's going to make the call.
Phil makes the call with an ace-3.
Phil Hellmuth actually dominated here. I'm surprised. Andy's played pretty tight for Phil to just call
moving in with anything over 10. Believe you. You didn't tell me you'd have 2 cards over.
He's in for 500,000. All that chipping away took Andy down to 500,000 in chips.
Well, so even if he doubles them up, Phil's not in bad shape here. Why not take a chance and gamble with him? Well, this could be history. Phil makes a comeback. I mean, he's got a dominated hand right now. Filicek's dominating Phil Hellmuth's hand, but
you sense a 3 coming up?
You know what? I almost do. Isn't that terrible? It's like,
here it is.
Oh my gosh! I'm telling you, it's like this is history.
9-3-4 rainbow, and Hellmuth has paired up the 3s. Now a queen.
Well, he's got him dead to 3 outs. A 10 or a 10 or a 10.
My, oh my. Hellmuth, will he win his 11th
history in the making
bracelet? Yes!
Oh,
and Phil Hellmuth has won his 11th bracelet.
Oh, baby!
Unbelievable.
He was dominated, and it didn't matter.
Wow!
Well, he had chipped away at him to where it didn't matter. But then he caught the 3 just for good measure. Wow.
So 42-year-old Phil Hellmuth has won his 11th World Series of Poker bracelet, and he breaks a 3-way tie with 2 legends, Dolly Brunson and Johnny Chan, and it is Phil Hellmuth alone at the top of the mountain with 11 bracelets, 60 World Series of Poker cashes. Right now, Phil Hellmuth is looking for the Dom. And I don't mean the Don, I mean the Dom.
Dom Perignon, you're right.